She had known for 11 days, and tonight everything was ready. The table was flawless. 12 place settings, 12 candles, and hidden behind the head chair, where no one but her could possibly see it, rested a slim black leather briefcase. Her name was Sable Quinton, a 34-year-old financial attorney, and one of Manhattan's most respected legal minds. She was the woman who had folded every napkin into perfect triangles before sunrise, polished the Tiffany candlesticks until she could see her own reflection in them, and prepared a Christmas dinner worthy of a magazine cover. 12 guests were coming that evening, including the man she was about to destroy. Not with rage, not with revenge, with the truth. But Sable was never in a hurry. She never had been. At exactly 6:45 that evening, her husband walked through the front door, right on schedule. He wore the charcoal gray suit she had chosen for him 2 Christmases earlier at a boutique on Madison Avenue, and he was smiling. That smile. The smile that had once been the first thing that she loved about Graydon Fitch. The smile that made everyone in a room feel as though they had somehow been personally chosen. Then she noticed the woman standing behind him, red hair pulled into a loose ponytail, a cream-colored wool coat that moved the way expensive fabric moves, effortlessly, as if even the coat understood its place in the world. The woman stepped carefully across the threshold. Her heels clicked once against the marble floor before disappearing into the softness of the Persian rug. She looked around the house with the practiced expression of someone pretending to admire things she had already decided should belong to her. Graydon turned toward his wife and delivered the line he had clearly rehearsed in the car. After 9 years together, Sable could easily tell the difference between spontaneous words and prepared ones. "Babe, this is Petra. She's a branding consultant for the company. She doesn't have anywhere to go for Christmas, so I told her she should join us. You don't mind, do you?" The decision had already been made. The question was only there for appearance. Sable looked at Petra Lane, not with anger, not with recognition, but with the careful attention of a woman who spent her life reading contracts and understood that the most important information was usually hidden inside the details everyone else ignored. Then she smiled. "Of course not," she said warmly. "Welcome. Let me take your coat." She stepped forward and accepted the cream-colored coat with both hands. She carried it to the hallway closet, not to the wire hanger in the back, but to the polished wooden hanger reserved for guests she intended to honor. She smoothed the shoulders, closed the closet door, and guided Petra into the warmth of a home filled with pine, roasted garlic, and soft Christmas music. "Sit wherever you'd like," Sable said pleasantly. "We have plenty of room." Petra smiled, placed her purse beside her plate, crossed her legs, and settled comfortably into her chair. She carried the quiet confidence of a woman who believed she was safe. She had no idea what was hidden behind the head chair. No one did. Inside the black leather briefcase were 5 white envelopes. Each one had been carefully labeled in Sable's handwriting. Each one was sealed. Each one contained another piece of evidence connecting perfectly to the next. For 11 days, Sable had built them one by one with patience and precision, like a woman laying railroad tracks toward a destination only she could see. She had already waited 11 days. Waiting a few more hours would be easy. Sable turned and walked back toward the kitchen. The roast needed another 20 minutes, and then Christmas dinner could begin. Chapter 2. Before dinner continues, you need to understand something about Sable Quinton. She wasn't the kind of woman who cried in parking lots. She wasn't the kind who sent 3 unanswered texts or begged someone to explain themselves. And she certainly wasn't the kind who begged anyone to stay. Life had taught her certain lessons early enough that those choices had stopped feeling like choices a long time ago. She grew up in Utica, New York, not in the wealthy part, but in the neighborhood where February heating bills had to be planned for back in October. Her mother worked 2 jobs, cleaning houses during the day and waiting tables several nights a week. Yet, somehow, no matter how tired she still sat beside Sable's bed every evening and read to her, not because she had energy left, but because she had made a decision. Her daughter would have a bigger life than she did, even if she had to build that future one brick at a time. When Sable was 17, a school counselor gently suggested that community college might be the most realistic option given her family's finances. The counselor wasn't cruel. She was simply being practical. Sable listened politely and then ignored the advice entirely. She applied for every scholarship she could find. She worked 2 part-time jobs before graduation, one at the public library and another at a copy shop downtown. When she enrolled at Syracuse University, she kept both jobs. 4 years passed without shortcuts, without excuses, and without a single semester below a 3.9 GPA. Not because someone was watching, because she had made a promise to herself, and Sable Quinton treated promises seriously. Fordham Law School came next. The loans were real. The pressure was real. There were nights during her first year when she sat alone at her desk, after 6 straight hours of studying, and wondered exactly how much of her future she was gambling on herself. She knew what failure would cost. She simply refused to let it happen. At 26, she graduated near the top of her class with $31,000 in student debt, a law degree she had earned the hard way, and a quiet confidence that no financial pressure could shake. 9 months later, she was hired by a prestigious Park Avenue law firm, specializing in estate and financial law, where a single overlooked sentence could cost a client millions. On the corner of her desk sat a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, not as decoration. The spine was cracked. Several pages were folded. She had read it 4 times already and knew she would read it again. Every morning she drank black coffee. Every morning she drove the same gray Toyota Camry into Manhattan. Some of her colleagues drove BMWs. Others drove Mercedes. A few occasionally joked about her car. Sable always smiled and never explained. People who are truly secure in their power don't need expensive toys to announce it. Then she met Graydon Fitch. They met at a company holiday party when she was 28. A colleague brought him along. He arrived carrying a bottle of wine and a smile, large enough to light up the room. But what caught her attention wasn't the smile. It was the way he listened. He asked questions and actually waited for the answers. He talked about building something meaningful, something useful, something that mattered. Spoke with the kind of kitkin that made people believe he would actually do it. Sable had always been cautious around men. Life had taught her that character isn't revealed during the best moments. It's revealed during ordinary ones. Who are they when nobody needs anything from them? Who are they when nobody is watching? In those early years, Graydon appeared to be the same man whether anyone was watching or not. And she believed him. They married when she was 31. The ceremony took place on a Wednesday afternoon at the Greenwich Courthouse. Just the two of them and 2 witnesses. Nothing extravagant. Sable wore an ivory silk dress she had found in a vintage shop in the West Village. Simple, elegant, perfect. Inside her purse was her mother's silver pen, a slim Waterman fountain pen, engraved with her initials in lettering so small you had to hold it close to read it. Her mother had given it to her the day she passed the bar exam. Holding the pen with both hands, Tears shining in her eyes, she had said, "Use this for every important signature you'll ever make." Sable used it to sign her marriage certificate. For a while, life felt exactly right. Then Graydon had an idea. A fintech startup called ClearPath Capital. A platform designed to simplify financial planning for small and mid-sized businesses. The concept was strong. The market was real. Graydon had the charisma to walk into a room full of investors and convince them they were looking at the future. What he didn't have was the legal foundation necessary to build that future. That part belonged to Sable. For 4 months, she spent evenings and weekends building the framework. She drafted operating agreements, created intellectual property protections, structured investor safeguards, and introduced Graydon to 3 influential angel investors from her own professional network. These were people who trusted her judgment because she had spent years earning that trust. She wrote every critical clause, reviewed every key document, built every legal wall protecting the company from future threats. Without Sable, ClearPath Capital would never have survived its first funding round. Then a major estate dispute exploded at her law firm. A multi-state legal battle involving 97 depositions and months of 16-hour workdays. Sable trusted Graydon to manage the company while she handled the case. She checked in whenever she could because that was what partners did. They trusted each other. Then one Tuesday morning in December, everything changed. She was reviewing financial disclosures at her desk when a transfer notification caught her eye. $18,000 had been withdrawn from their joint account and sent to an LLC she didn't recognize. Most people would have ignored it. Most people would have asked about it later. Sable was not most people. Within 10 minutes, she had traced the registration records. The registered agent was a woman named Petra Lane. The same Petra Lane who was now sitting at her Christmas table. Sable stared at the screen for 3 straight hours. She didn't cry. She didn't call Graydon. She didn't confront anyone. Instead, she opened a blank document and she started typing. By the time she left the office that evening, the file was already 6 pages long. By Christmas Eve, it had grown to 12, because once Sable Quinton discovered the truth, she didn't react. She prepared, and those 11 days would change everything. Day 1 began with a simple question. Where had the money gone? Sable started with the LLC registered under Petra Lane's name. The address on file led to a Park Avenue office that appeared completely ordinary on the surface. But Sable had spent her career learning that important things rarely hid in obvious places. They hid behind paperwork, assumptions, and details most people never bothered to examine. By midnight, she had traced the registration through multiple public records and uncovered 3 separate shell companies operating from the same address. 2 of them connected directly to ClearPath Capital. That was when she found the amendment. The document had been filed 6 weeks earlier. It removed Sable Quinton as co-founder and voting shareholder and listed Graydon Fitch as the sole, controlling founder of the company. At the bottom appeared her signature, or at least something intended to look like it. Sable studied the filing carefully before checking the date. The amendment had supposedly been signed on a Thursday afternoon. The problem was that she knew exactly where she had been that day. She had spent the entire afternoon in federal court, cross-examining a financial expert witness in a multi-million-dollar estate dispute. There were transcripts, security records, witnesses, and video footage. She could not possibly have signed the document. Sable placed the original founding documents beside the amendment and began comparing every detail. Then she opened a new file and started constructing a timeline. Every filing, every transfer, every inconsistency, every suspicious decision. She worked methodically, like an architect inspecting a foundation, before deciding which wall needed to come down first. Day 2 belonged to Cass Beaumont. Cass had worked beside Sable for 4 years and had earned her trust the hard way. She was sharp, efficient, and completely incapable of pretending a problem didn't exist simply because acknowledging it would be uncomfortable. They met after work, and for 30 uninterrupted minutes, Sable laid everything on the table. The missing money, the shell companies, the forged amendment, Petra Lane, every detail she had uncovered. When she finished speaking, Cass sat quietly for several seconds before asking a single question. What do you need me to do? Not, are you sure? Not, maybe there's another explanation. Not, let's wait before we act. Just one question. What do you need? For the first time since discovering the transfer, Sable allowed herself a small smile. Real loyalty rarely arrives with dramatic speeches. More often, it sounds exactly like that. Day 4 brought Hadley Crane. Sable called him early Thursday morning, and less than a minute later, he asked her to come to his office immediately. Crane and Associates occupied the 40th floor of a Park Avenue tower overlooking Manhattan. The firm had a reputation that made opposing attorneys nervous before a case even began. Years earlier, Hadley had taught advanced transactional law when Sable was still a student. Most professors rushed to fill silence because silence made them uncomfortable. Hadley used silence as a tool. He asked difficult questions and then waited patiently for honest answers. When Sable arrived, he pointed toward the chair across from his desk. No small talk, no introductions, no wasted time. She placed the file in front of him and waited. Hadley opened it and began reading. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. The only sounds in the office came from distant city traffic and the occasional turning of a page. When he finally finished, he closed the folder and rested both hands on top of it. Have you shown this to anyone else? He asked. No. He stood and walked toward the window overlooking Manhattan. Below them, the city moved through another gray December afternoon. Thousands of people hurrying toward destinations they believed mattered. For nearly a minute, he said nothing. Then, he finally spoke. You built everything he has. Sable nodded. I know. Hadley continued, staring out the window. When this becomes public, he said quietly, he's going to learn exactly what that means. There was no anger in his voice, no excitement, only certainty. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. Day 5 belonged to Cass again. She drove to Greenwich and parked half a block from the house. For nearly 2 hours, she sat inside her car, making calls, pulling records, cross-checking filings, and connecting information that had never been intended to be connected. Shortly before noon, she found something significant. 2 months earlier, a home equity line of credit had been expanded using the marital home as collateral. The application listed only one owner, Graydon Fitch, not Graydon and Sable, just Graydon. Cass stared at the paperwork, took photographs, and immediately texted Sable 3 simple words, add this to. Sable looked at the message and created another folder. Day 7 was dedicated to the guest list. The 12 people invited to Christmas dinner had not been chosen randomly. Every seat served a purpose. 2 major investors would attend, both originally introduced to ClearPath through Sable's professional network. The company accountant would be there as well, along with a former colleague of Graydon's who had quietly expressed concern about recent corporate changes. Cass would attend. Hadley would attend. On the invitation, Hadley was simply listed as a family friend. One evening, Graydon casually reviewed the guest list while drinking a glass of water in the kitchen. He scanned the names, smiled, and said, "Looks like a great group." He never recognized Hadley's name because he never imagined he would need to. Day 9 was spent preparing the envelopes. 5 envelopes. 5 collections of evidence. Each one organized with surgical precision. Certified copies, financial records, corporate filings, property documents, timelines and proof, not accusations, not theories. Proof, the kind that survives scrutiny, the kind that survives courtrooms, the kind that survives lies. Sable placed each envelope inside the black leather briefcase and closed it carefully. Then she sat quietly for several minutes, not thinking about revenge but about completion, about finishing something properly. Finally she stood, put on her coat, drove to a bakery on Post Road, and ordered a Christmas tart for 12 people. Because Christmas dinner was still happening. Then day 11 arrived, Christmas Eve. Sable woke before sunrise. By 7 o'clock that morning, the briefcase was already hidden behind the head chair in the dining room. It was in place before Graydon came downstairs, before the house woke up, and before the day officially began. Then she started cooking. The roast went into the oven. The pine garlands were arranged. The Tiffany lamps were polished. Everything stood exactly where it belonged. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Dottie Fitch arrived to help. For 3 hours, the two women worked side by side in the kitchen, discussing oven temperatures, recipes, table settings, and whether the tart would be enough for 12 people. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. Then, at one point, Dottie set down a serving spoon and gently placed her hand on Sable's arm. Neither woman spoke. Neither woman needed to. Some truths become too large for words. By 6:30, guests began arriving. At 6:45, Graydon walked through the front door with Petra Lane beside him. Sable smiled, took Petra's coat, hung it carefully inside the closet, and welcomed her into the house. The candles were lit. The table was ready. The guests were arriving. The briefcase was waiting. And for the first time in 11 days, Sable Quinton stopped preparing. Because now it was time for Christmas dinner. By 7:30, every chair at the table was occupied. The dining room looked exactly the way Sable had envisioned it. It was the kind of table that immediately made people feel cared for the moment they sat down. Every candle flickered softly against polished crystal. The pine garlands stretched the length of the table, and the Tiffany lamps cast a warm glow across faces that appeared relaxed, comfortable, and completely unaware of what the evening would eventually become. It was a table built by someone who believed hospitality was not a performance, but a reflection of character. Petra Lane sat 3 seats from the left side of the table, holding her wine glass delicately by the stem. She complimented the decorations with exactly the right amount of enthusiasm, asked questions about the Christmas tart, and smiled at all the appropriate moments. To anyone watching, she appeared perfectly at ease. She was performing warmth, and she was very good at it. Meanwhile, Graydon moved through the evening exactly as he always did. He refilled glasses before anyone asked, inserted jokes into conversations at precisely the right moment, and made every guest feel welcome. It was one of his greatest talents. Graydon understood how to command a room without appearing to command it. People trusted him because he knew how to make trust feel effortless. Near the fireplace, he was introduced to Hadley Crane. Graydon extended his hand confidently, offering the firm handshake of a man who believed himself to be among equals. "Nice to finally meet you," he said. "Sable's said wonderful things about you." Hadley accepted the handshake and replied with a simple, "Likewise." Nothing more. No attempt to impress. No effort to continue the conversation. Just one word delivered with calm restraint. Graydon smiled politely and moved on. Across the room, Sable watched the exchange with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had already read the final page of a story, while everyone else was still reading the introduction. At the far end of the table sat Dottie Fitch, observing the room with the patient attention she had developed over a lifetime. Dottie had long ago learned that people revealed far more through their eyes, hands, and silences than through their actual words. She watched her son move around the room. She watched Petra watching her son. And she watched Sable watching both of them. Dinner was served shortly after 8 o'clock. Sable moved around the table with effortless efficiency, making sure every guest had what they needed. While everyone else focused on food and conversation, she focused on details. She noticed the company accountant refill his wine glass twice within 15 minutes, far more than he normally drank at professional gatherings. She noticed one investor lean toward another and whisper something during the first course. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the second investor nod slowly, the way people nod when someone has just confirmed a suspicion they already carried. Then Petra made a mistake. During a discussion about her consulting work, she casually referenced specific details about ClearPath's fourth quarter planning cycle. The comment lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough. The information was too specific. It wasn't the kind of detail an outside consultant would normally know. Graydon noticed immediately. For the briefest moment, something tightened behind his smile before he quickly redirected the conversation and guided everyone's attention elsewhere. Most people never would have noticed. But Sable noticed, and so did the accountant. His fork paused halfway to his mouth before continuing. He didn't say anything because he didn't need to. As the evening continued, conversations flowed naturally around the table. Politics, business, holiday traditions, and travel plans for the new year blended together beneath the warm glow of candlelight. Laughter drifted through the dining room. Wine glasses emptied and were refilled. Christmas music played softly in the background. To an outsider, it looked like the perfect holiday gathering. Then, nearly 40 minutes into dinner, another moment occurred. A small moment, the kind most people would have missed entirely. Graydon leaned toward Petra and whispered something into her ear. Not across the table, not loudly enough for anyone else to hear, close enough that their shoulders touched. Petra's expression changed instantly. It lasted less than a second. A private smile, a reflex, the kind of look two people share when they believe no one is watching. The kind of look that cannot be rehearsed. Dottie saw it. She lowered her fork onto her plate and stared quietly at her dinner. Her wedding ring made a faint sound against the porcelain as she smoothed her napkin across her lap. Across the table, Sable continued eating as if nothing had happened. Calm, composed, patient. She had waited 11 days. She could wait a little longer, because dessert had not yet been served, and neither had the truth. Chapter 5. The 5 envelopes. Sable waited until every plate had been cleared from the table. Dessert arrived at precisely 9:15. The caramel glaze on the Christmas tart cracked perfectly beneath each spoon, and for several minutes the room returned to the comfortable rhythm of an ordinary holiday gathering. Guests complimented the dessert. Wine glasses were topped off one final time. Laughter drifted through the dining room. To anyone walking past the windows, it would have looked like 12 successful adults enjoying a beautiful Christmas evening. That illusion lasted exactly 4 minutes. Sable set down her fork and reached beneath the head chair. When she straightened again, the black leather briefcase was in her hands. She placed it beside her dessert plate with a quiet, deliberate movement that immediately drew attention. The conversation nearest her stopped first. Then another conversation ended. Then another. Within seconds, every eye at the table had found the briefcase. Graydon looked at it, and something flickered across his face. Not recognition. Not yet. Just the involuntary alertness of a man encountering something unexpected inside a space he believed he controlled. He glanced at Sable. She met his gaze calmly. Her expression revealed nothing. Then she stood. "I'd like to say a few words," she said. The room became silent, not because she raised her voice, but because she didn't. Sable possessed the kind of presence that never needed volume to command attention. Graydon smiled and gestured toward her, with theatrical generosity, still believing he understood the nature of the evening, still believing he was participating in the event rather than becoming the event itself. Sable slowly looked around the table. She met the eyes of both investors, then the accountant, then Cass at the far end of the room, then Dottie. Finally, she looked at Hadley Crane. Only after that did she begin. "This house was built on trust," she said. Her voice remained steady, clear, and controlled. "I designed the renovations when we purchased it. I selected every piece of furniture in this dining room. I paid for the structural repairs because I read every page of the inspection report and knew exactly which walls carried the weight of the house." She paused briefly. "I also built the legal structure of ClearPath Capital. I drafted the original operating agreements. I introduced the company to its first investors, two of whom are sitting at this table tonight. I held co-founder status both in writing and in reality from the day the company was created." Graydon placed his fork down. "Sable," he said carefully, "this isn't the time or place to revisit professional disagreements." She didn't even look at him. 6 weeks ago, corporate amendments were filed removing me as co-founder and voting shareholder. Those amendments contain my signature. I did not sign them. Then she opened the briefcase. The sound of the clasps releasing seemed louder than it should have. Sable removed the first envelope and placed it on the table. No dramatic gesture, no anger, just certainty. Inside this envelope are the original founding documents alongside the amended filings. The signature discrepancies are documented and supported by a forensic handwriting analysis. One of the investors immediately reached forward and picked up the envelope. He opened it without asking permission. For the first time all evening, Graydon's confidence visibly shifted. "This is a private legal matter," he said. "It has nothing to do with anyone else at this table. Two people at this table are major investors in the company," Sable replied calmly. "Their ownership interests depend on the validity of those documents. I believe it concerns them directly." She removed the second envelope. "This contains records of an $18,000 transfer from our joint account on December 13th. The funds were transferred to an LLC registered to Petra Lane." Silence spread across the room like a wave. Every head turned toward Petra. To her credit, Petra didn't panic. She sat perfectly still, with both hands resting on the table. But the confidence she had carried into the house was gone. Graydon pushed his chair back slightly. "That transaction is completely out of context," he said. "It's a business payment that can easily be explained." Sable reached for the third envelope. This envelope contains the lease agreement for an apartment in Tribeca. The tenant is Petra Lane. The cosigner is Graydon Fitch. The lease was executed 14 months ago. Monthly payments were made through an operating account connected to ClearPath Capital. The company accountant slowly lowered his wine glass onto the table. His movements were controlled, but the message was obvious. He knew exactly which account she was talking about, and judging by his expression, he had known far more than he had ever admitted. Then Hadley Crane stood. The movement immediately shifted the room. Hadley folded his napkin once, placed it beside his plate, and calmly buttoned his jacket. There was no urgency in anything he did. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had spent 20 years walking into difficult situations and leaving with the outcome he intended. "Allow me to introduce myself properly," he said. "My name is Hadley Crane, managing partner of Crane and Associates. I represent Sable Quinton regarding the fraudulent co-founder amendment, the recovery of marital assets, and several related claims involving ClearPath Capital." Then he removed 2 business cards and placed one in front of each investor. "My office will be in contact beginning Monday morning." The room felt smaller after that. Graydon looked around the table and realized something that had never occurred to him before. This wasn't a spontaneous confrontation. It wasn't an emotional outburst. It wasn't a wife reacting to betrayal. It was an operation. And every person in the room had already been positioned exactly where Sable wanted them. For the first time all evening, genuine panic entered his eyes. For several seconds after Hadley Crane introduced himself, nobody moved. The silence hanging over the table felt heavier than any argument could have. Graydon stood beside his chair, looking from Sable to Hadley, then to the investors who were already examining the contents of the envelopes with growing concern. The performance was over. The charming entrepreneur, the devoted husband, the visionary founder, all of it had disappeared in a matter of minutes, stripped away by documents, signatures, and facts that could not be argued with. Yet men like Graydon rarely surrendered immediately. People who spend years believing they control the narrative often become most dangerous when they realize they no longer do. "You planned this," Graydon finally said. His voice carried a sharp edge now, the smooth confidence replaced by something far less controlled. "You invited me into my own house and turned Christmas dinner into a courtroom." Sable met his eyes calmly. There was no satisfaction on her face, no visible triumph, and no anger. If anything, she looked exhausted. "You brought your mistress into this house on Christmas Eve and seated her at my table," she replied. "I simply decided everyone deserved the truth before dessert." The first investor rose from his chair. He gathered the documents, slipped Hadley's business card into his jacket pocket, and calmly put on his coat. There was no dramatic speech, no accusation, no confrontation. He simply crossed the room, shook Sable's hand, thanked her for informing him, and walked out the front door. The second investor followed less than a minute later. Neither man looked at Graydon as they left. Their departure changed the atmosphere immediately. Suddenly, the consequences were no longer theoretical. They were real. The company Graydon had spent years presenting as his personal achievement was beginning to slip away from him in real time. Across the table, the accountant remained seated, staring down at the documents spread before him. His expression carried the unmistakable look of a man reviewing every decision he had made during the past year, and wondering which ones might soon be examined by attorneys. Then Dottie Fitch stood. Once again, the room fell silent. She walked slowly around the table toward her son. Every step felt deliberate, measured, final. Graydon looked at her as though searching for support, for some sign that his mother would stand beside him, now that everything else was collapsing. Instead, Dottie removed the pearl bracelet from her wrist. Graydon had given it to her years earlier, when he received acceptance into his first choice, university. She had worn it almost every day since then. Without saying a word, she placed the bracelet on the table between them. For several moments, she simply looked at her son, not with anger, not even with disappointment, with sadness. The kind of sadness reserved for someone who knows exactly what a person could become and must now accept what that person chose instead. Finally, she spoke. "You were raised better than this." Then she turned and walked to Sable's side of the room. That hurt Graydon more than anything else that happened that night. Petra stood shortly afterward. She quietly collected her purse, retrieved her coat from the hallway closet, and left without speaking. Nobody stopped her. Nobody followed her. The front door closed softly behind her, and the sound seemed surprisingly small, considering how much damage had just been done. The evening unraveled quickly after that. Guests departed one by one. The candles continued burning. Christmas music still drifted softly from the kitchen speakers. Yet the house felt entirely different now. Cass remained behind to help clean. She moved through the kitchen loading dishes, organizing leftovers, and restoring order without needing instructions. Hadley stayed long enough to make sure Sable was all right. Before leaving, he paused in the hallway and studied her carefully. "Call me tomorrow morning if you need anything before Monday," he said. "I will," Sable replied. He nodded once and left. Dottie remained until the kitchen was spotless. She never mentioned what had happened during dinner. She simply washed dishes, dried glasses, wiped counters, and restored order wherever she could find disorder. When she finally prepared to leave, she stepped toward Sable and gently held her face between both hands. No speech, no advice, no attempt to explain the evening, just a kiss on the forehead. Then she walked out the front door without looking back. For the first time all evening, Graydon found himself completely alone. The dining room still glowed beneath the Tiffany lamps. The Christmas tree remained illuminated in the corner. Pine garlands stretched across the table exactly as they had a few hours earlier. Everything looked the same, yet nothing was the same. Graydon stood there staring at the empty chairs, trying to understand how a life could begin collapsing before the dishes were even cleared. Eventually, he followed Sable into the kitchen. He told her the investors would calm down. He insisted ClearPath was still his company. He argued that people would eventually realize he had been the true driving force behind its success. He spoke about relationships, influence, and reputation, as though repeating those words often enough might somehow restore them. What Graydon didn't realize was that Hadley Crane had not actually left yet. He was still standing near the hallway entrance, keys in hand, close enough to hear every word. Hadley didn't turn around. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "I strongly recommend that you consult legal counsel before continuing this conversation." The silence that followed lasted nearly a full minute. Graydon stopped speaking. For the first time, he understood exactly who Hadley Crane was. More importantly, for the first time, he understood how serious his situation had become. The next morning began with phone calls. One arrived shortly after 7 o'clock. Another followed less than 20 minutes later. Then another. Investors wanted explanations. Attorneys requested documentation. Meetings were canceled. Reviews were initiated. Questions that had been quietly ignored for months suddenly demanded answers. The company accountant called shortly before 9. During a tense conversation lasting less than 5 minutes, he repeatedly used words like disclosure, compliance, and independent counsel. When the call ended, Graydon sat alone in the kitchen staring at his phone. Then he called Petra. She answered from a Starbucks on Lexington Avenue. He could hear the city moving behind her. Graydon promised he would fix everything. He told her the situation wasn't as bad as it looked. He assured her that things would settle down. once everyone calmed down. Petra listened quietly before responding. They terminated the consulting agreement, she said. There was never a real contract. Everything I had came through you. Several seconds passed. Then she added, No, I don't think you can fix this. When the call ended, she never contacted him again. Hours later, Graydon remained seated in the kitchen. The Christmas tree still glowed in the corner. Every ornament hanging from its branches had been chosen by Sable over the course of 8 years. The handmade paper star on top had belonged to her mother. The traditions, memories, warmth, and stability that had filled the house had never really belonged to him. He was only realizing that now. For a long time he sat there staring at the tree. Then he finally spoke aloud. Not for sympathy, not for an audience, not for effect, just the truth. I threw it all away. And for the first time in years, there was nobody left to tell him otherwise. The divorce papers were ready on January 6th. Outside the windows of her Park Avenue office, Manhattan had already settled into the rhythm of a new year. Holiday decorations were disappearing from storefronts. Commuters rushed through crowded sidewalks, carrying fresh calendars and old ambitions, and the city moved forward exactly as it always had. New York had never cared much about anyone's personal heartbreak. It simply kept moving. Sable sat alone at her desk on the 22nd floor and reviewed the documents one final time. Not because she had doubts, but because habits built over a lifetime do not disappear, simply because emotions are involved. The terms were straightforward. The evidence was overwhelming. The outcome had long since become inevitable. When she reached the final signature page, she opened the top drawer of her desk and removed her mother's silver Waterman pen. For several seconds, she simply held it in her hand. It was the same pen she had used to sign her marriage certificate years earlier. The same pen her mother had placed in her hands after she passed the bar exam. The same pen that had accompanied nearly every important decision of her adult life. Slowly, she uncapped it and signed. No hesitation, no trembling hand, no dramatic pause. Just one clean signature, complete, final. When she finished, she set the pen down and leaned back in her chair. There was no sense of victory, no celebration, only relief. The kind of relief that arrives when a burden you have carried for far too long finally leaves your shoulders. After a few moments, she picked up her coffee, took a sip, and opened the next file waiting on her desk. Life continued. The legal proceedings moved faster than most people expected. Hadley Crane's firm had spent decades building a reputation for preparation, precision, and relentless execution, and this case proved no different. The forged corporate amendment was challenged immediately. Financial records were subpoenaed. Ownership documents were reviewed. Every transfer, every filing, and every discrepancy was examined. Within weeks, the evidence painted such a clear picture that even Graydon's attorneys stopped arguing facts and began negotiating consequences. 6 weeks later, the decision arrived. The amendment removing Sable as co-founder was declared invalid. The original founding documents were restored. Her ownership stake was reinstated in full. Every right she had spent years helping build was officially returned to her. The morning the ruling became public, Cass sent her a text message containing only one sentence. "Your name is back on the door." Sable looked at the screen for several moments before replying with a single period. That was enough. Cass understood immediately. The victory itself wasn't what mattered. The restoration was. ClearPath Capital continued operating under a board-appointed CEO, and the governance structure returned to the original framework Sable had designed years earlier. Investor confidence stabilized almost immediately. Internal reviews uncovered additional issues that were quietly corrected. By the end of the first quarter, the company was performing better than it had in years. Several board members privately admitted something they had never fully appreciated before. The company had always depended far more on Sable than they realized. As for Sable, she had no interest in returning to daily operations. She converted her ownership position into a long-term financial interest that would continue generating income for years to come. It was clean, documented, secure. Most importantly, it belonged entirely to her. Graydon's situation unfolded very differently. His legal challenges multiplied. The investors who had once supported him shifted their attention toward protecting the company rather than protecting him. Business relationships that had taken years to build began disappearing one by one. By February, he accepted a settlement, granting Sable full ownership of the Greenwich house, reimbursement of improperly transferred marital assets, and payment of her legal expenses. He signed quietly. There was no fight left. Shortly afterward, Graydon moved into a luxury apartment on the opposite side of the city. People still recognized his name occasionally, but far fewer people called. Far fewer invitations arrived. Far fewer people seemed interested in what he was doing. The truth about success, Graydon discovered, was that many relationships survive only as long as success does. Without the company, without the investors, and without the image he had spent years constructing, there wasn't much left. One evening near the end of February, he found himself sitting alone in his apartment, staring out across the city skyline. The view was expensive. The furniture was expensive. Everything around him suggested success. Yet the silence inside the apartment felt enormous. For the first time in years, there was nobody waiting for him at home. No traditions, no routines, no familiar voice asking how his day had gone. No one. And no amount of money could buy those things back. Meanwhile, Sable's life became unexpectedly quieter, not easier, not perfect, just quieter. The constant tension that had lived beneath the surface of her marriage was gone. She spent longer evenings reading. She returned to early morning walks through Central Park. She accepted fewer unnecessary obligations and spent more time with people whose presence felt restorative rather than exhausting. The strangest part was how ordinary happiness felt once she stopped trying to hold together something that had already broken. She no longer checked her phone wondering whether someone was being honest. She no longer carried responsibilities that had never truly belonged to her. For years, she had been managing crises she didn't create. Now she simply managed her own life, and she was remarkably good at it. One snowy afternoon near the end of January, she stood beside her office window, watching flakes drift between the buildings. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from Hadley. Simple, professional, direct. The way all of his messages were. Lunch next week? No mention of legal strategy. No mention of court filings. No mention of business. Just lunch. For reasons she couldn't entirely explain, Sable smiled. Then she typed a single word. Yes. And, for the first time since Christmas Eve, the future felt like something she could look forward to, instead of something she needed to survive. By March, lunch had quietly become a routine. Neither Sable nor Hadley had planned for that to happen. Their first meeting after the legal proceedings had been practical, centered on documents, arbitration timelines, board decisions, and the lingering details that always remain after a major case. The second lunch contained less business. The third contained almost none. Before either of them realized it, they had developed the kind of rhythm that forms naturally between two people who genuinely enjoy each other's company. One afternoon in early March, they sat together in a quiet corner booth at a restaurant near Hadley's office on Park Avenue. Several legal documents rested on the table between them, but neither had looked at them in nearly half an hour. The papers remained untouched, while the conversation drifted toward entirely different subjects. Nell Crane had become one of those subjects. A week after Christmas, she had mailed Sable a paperback copy of The Obstacle is the Way, along with a handwritten note. The handwriting was neat, direct, and refreshingly honest. The note read, "My dad says, you're the calmest person he's ever seen in a crisis. I think that's his version of a compliment. Let me know what you think of the book." Sable had laughed the moment she read it. Not a polite laugh, not the kind people offer out of courtesy. A real laugh. The kind that arrives before you have time to decide whether to hold it back. Now, sitting across from Hadley, she told him about the note. For several seconds, he stared down at his coffee before smiling. It wasn't a large smile, but it was genuine. "She's not wrong," he said. "About the book?" Sable asked. "About the compliment." Sable raised an eyebrow. "That's a high compliment coming from you." Hadley nodded once. "It is." Somehow that simple answer carried more weight than a longer explanation ever could. The conversation drifted elsewhere after that. They discussed books, travel, the strange ways people rebuild themselves after disappointment, and the challenge of recognizing the difference between responsibility and obligation. Neither person rushed the conversation. Neither felt any need to fill silence whenever it appeared. That had always been one of the things Sable appreciated most about Hadley. His silences never felt empty. They felt thoughtful. Eventually, he grew quiet again, not distracted or distant, simply considering something. Sable had learned to recognize the difference. Finally, he set down his coffee cup and said, "I'm glad you called me." The statement seemed simple enough, yet something about the way he said it made her pause. "I didn't know who else to call," she admitted. "I know," he replied. A brief silence settled between them before he added, "But you called the right person." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the restaurant windows, late afternoon sunlight reflected off nearby buildings. Winter was beginning to loosen its grip on the city. The first hints of spring had started appearing in warmer air and longer evenings. Sable found herself thinking about what Hadley had said, the right person. Life rarely provides many of those. There are people who appear when everything is easy. There are people who celebrate success because success is enjoyable to stand beside. Then there are the people who answer the phone when everything is falling apart. The people who stay when staying becomes inconvenient. The people who never ask whether helping will benefit them before deciding to help anyway. Those people are rare, and once you recognize them, you never forget them. "I'm glad I called too," Sable finally said. This time it was Hadley's turn to smile. The smile lingered for several seconds before he looked out the window toward the city. Neither of them felt any need to say more. Some truths arrive quietly. The months passed. Spring replaced winter. The legal disputes became history instead of daily reality. Life continued moving forward. One evening in June, Dottie hosted a small dinner at her home in Greenwich. The guest list was modest, consisting only of family, close friends, and the few people who genuinely mattered. Sable arrived carrying a bottle of wine. Hadley arrived with Nell. Within minutes, Nell had claimed the seat beside Sable. For nearly 40 minutes, the two of them talked about books, college applications, and the essay Nell was writing for admissions counselors. At one point, she asked whether it was possible to become a successful attorney without sacrificing the rest of your life. Sable answered without hesitation, "Absolutely." The certainty in her voice surprised even her. Years earlier, she might have answered differently. Years earlier, she believed success required constant sacrifice. Now she knew better. Across the table, Hadley watched the conversations unfold, while Dottie quietly watched him. A small smile appeared on her face as she lifted her wine glass and took a sip. Some observations didn't require commentary. Christmas arrived again faster than anyone expected. The house in Greenwich looked almost exactly the same. The Tiffany lamps glowed warmly. Pine garlands stretched across the dining room. Soft piano music drifted from the kitchen speakers. Yet the atmosphere felt entirely different. There were only 9 guests this year. Cass was there. Dottie was there. Hadley was there. Nell was there. A handful of close friends completed the table. No performances, no hidden agendas, no lies. Just people who genuinely wanted to be there. As dinner began, Sable stood briefly at the head of the table and looked around the room. Candlelight reflected across familiar faces. Laughter drifted through the house. Warmth filled every corner. For a moment, she thought about the previous Christmas. The briefcase, the envelopes, the betrayal, the collapse. Then she looked at the people surrounding her now and realized something important. Nothing she had lost that night belonged in this room anymore. So she didn't give a speech. She didn't make a toast. She simply sat down, picked up her fork, and joined the people who had chosen to stay. Marcus Aurelius spent much of his adult life writing private reflections that were never intended to be published. He wrote after battles and before them. He wrote while carrying the weight of an empire that constantly threatened to fracture beneath him. He was one of the most powerful men in history. Yet the pages he left behind were not filled with stories of victory or celebrations of success. Instead, they contained reminders about discipline, perspective, responsibility, and character. Those writings survived because they were honest. They were never written for applause. They were written for truth. One idea appears throughout his reflections again and again. The obstacle is not separate from the path. The obstacle becomes the path. The thing standing in your way is often the very thing that reveals who you are. Most people spend their lives hoping difficulty will disappear. Marcus believed something different. He believed adversity was the material from which character is built. Not because suffering itself is valuable, but because challenges reveal strengths that comfort never can. Sable Quinton never planned to discover the strongest version of herself during a Christmas dinner in Greenwich. She wasn't searching for a lesson. She wasn't looking for transformation. She was simply preparing a holiday meal for people she cared about. Yet, life rarely asks permission before delivering its challenges. Betrayal arrived anyway. Disappointment arrived anyway. Pain arrived anyway. The difference was never what happened to her. The difference was what she chose to do after it happened. For 11 days, she gathered facts instead of excuses. She pursued clarity instead of revenge. She focused on truth instead of emotion. Most importantly, she refused to trade her dignity for temporary satisfaction. Anyone can react when they are hurt. Very few people can remain disciplined when they have every reason not to. That discipline became her advantage. The truth about betrayal is something many people never fully understand, because the pain is often too loud to hear anything else. Betrayal always arrives carrying information. It reveals weaknesses that were previously hidden. It exposes foundations that cannot support the weight placed upon them. It separates appearance from reality. The experience is painful, but pain often functions as a teacher. It shows us which relationships are built on integrity and which relationships are built on convenience. It shows us who remains when circumstances become difficult. It shows us where trust has been invested without evidence. The lesson is expensive, but the lesson is real. When Sable rebuilt her life, she did not do it with anything new. She used the same tools she had always possessed: intelligence, patience, discipline, work ethic, integrity. The silver pen her mother had placed in her hands years earlier. The difference was that she stopped using those gifts to support someone who failed to appreciate their value. Once she redirected that energy toward herself, everything changed. The strength had always been there. The direction simply changed. There is another lesson hidden inside this story as well. Dottie Fitch removed a pearl bracelet and placed it on a table. The gesture lasted only a few seconds, yet it carried the weight of a lifetime. She did not make that decision for appearances. She did not make it for the room. She made it because she understood something many people spend years avoiding. Love without integrity eventually becomes permission. Loyalty without accountability eventually becomes weakness. Sometimes the most loving thing a person can do is stand beside what is right, instead of standing beside what is familiar. And then there were the people who stayed. Cass stayed. Hadley stayed. Nell stayed. Dottie stayed. Not because they were obligated to. Not because they benefited from doing so. They stayed because character recognizes character. They stayed because difficult moments reveal who people truly are. Grand declarations are easy. Presence is harder. Yet the people who matter most are often the ones who quietly remain in the room long after everyone else has left. Sometimes support arrives as a phone call answered on the first ring. Sometimes it arrives as a business card placed calmly on a table. Sometimes it arrives as a handwritten note tucked inside a book. Sometimes it arrives as someone simply choosing not to leave. Those people matter. Hold on to them when you find them. They will stay longer than charm. They will stay longer than success. They will stay longer than appearances. And they will often become the foundation upon which your next chapter is built. 1 year earlier, Sable sat at the head of a Christmas table preparing to expose a betrayal. 1 year later, she sat at another Christmas table surrounded by people she trusted. The house looked almost identical. The decorations were nearly the same. The candles still glowed. The music still played. Yet everything had changed because she had changed. She no longer measured her life by what she had lost. She measured it by what remained. And what remained was enough. Perhaps that is the final lesson. Not every ending arrives wrapped in revenge. Not every victory arrives through punishment. Sometimes the greatest victory is refusing to become bitter. Sometimes the greatest revenge is building a life so peaceful that the people who hurt you no longer occupy space inside it. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is sit down at their own table, surrounded by the people who truly belong there, and continue moving forward. If this story touched something inside you, remember this: you are not the only person who has ever been underestimated. You are not the only person who has ever been betrayed by someone you trusted. And you are certainly not the only person capable of rebuilding something stronger than what was lost. Every story eventually reaches its ending, including yours. The only question is what you choose to build next, because every ending is also a beginning. A year from now, most people who attended that Christmas dinner will remember the evening differently. Some will remember the envelopes. Some will remember the silence that followed. Others will remember the moment. Hadley Crane stood up and introduced himself. But the people who truly understood what happened that night will remember something else entirely. They will remember a woman who refused to let betrayal determine her character. They will remember someone who chose preparation over panic, dignity over revenge, and truth over performance. Life rarely unfolds the way we expect. The plans we build can collapse. The people we trust can disappoint us. The future we imagined can disappear almost overnight. Yet every ending creates space for something new. Every closed door forces us to notice another one standing open. What happened to Sable was painful, but it also revealed something she could not have discovered any other way. She was stronger than she knew, more capable than she realized, more resilient than anyone, including herself, had fully understood. Perhaps that is true for all of us. We often discover our strength only after we are forced to use it. We discover our courage only after fear arrives. We discover who truly belongs in our lives only after circumstances give people the opportunity to leave. And when those moments come, we are given a choice. We can focus on what was taken from us, or we can focus on what remains. We can spend years looking backward, or we can begin building forward. Sable chose to build forward. She chose peace over bitterness. She chose gratitude over resentment. Most importantly, she chose not to allow someone else's failure of character to become her own. In the end, that decision changed everything. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of a chapter in your own life, or if it gave you hope that difficult seasons do eventually pass, take a moment to share it with someone who may need that reminder today. And remember, being underestimated is not the end of your story. Being betrayed is not the end of your story. Losing something important is not the end of your story. As long as you continue moving forward, the next chapter is still waiting to be written. Thank you for spending this time with us. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe for more powerful love drama stories filled with resilience, redemption, and unforgettable life lessons. Until next time, take care of yourself, trust your strength, and never forget that your best chapter may still be ahead of you.